Good morning, everybody. I'm going to suggest we get started. Just to remind everybody that at the end of the presentation, we'll be doing a Q&A. So please prepare your questions and post them to the Q&A function in Zoom. Again, good morning. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President, International Development Services Group, and on behalf of the team at the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I'll be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. Dr. Jacob Zenn returns. Grateful for you, Jacob, for taking the time to speak with us again. As I learned through Zoom, father of a young family. Jacob returns to speak on Boko Haram's past, present, and future, and their relationship with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Dr. Jacob Zenn is an adjunct professor on African armed movements and violent non-state actors in the world of world politics at Georgetown University Security Studies Program, and a fellow on African and Eurasian Affairs for the Jamestown Foundation in Washington, D.C. He wrote the book Unmasking Boko Haram, Exploring Global Jihad in Nigeria, which was published in April 2020 by Lynne Rienner in association with the Handa Centre for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence in the University of St. Andrews. Jacob has written on international law and security and several reports and monographs on Boko Haram, including editing a multi-authored report for the West Point Combating Terrorism Center in May of 2018 called Boko Haram Beyond the Headlines, Analysis of Africa's Enduring Insurgency. For his most recent academic work, see Jacob Zenn 2022, Boko Haram's Beginnings, Guantánamo, Detainee, Assessment Revelations on Diaspora, Nigerian Jihadists in Saudi Arabia, and in the Journal of the Middle East and Africa. As I mentioned earlier, it's a mouthful. As I mentioned earlier, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will have plenty of time for questions. So Jacob, again, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center for hosting me once again. Today, I want to begin by speaking about an important new trend in the Boko Haram insurgency. And in particular, I'll be talking about Islamic State in West Africa province, otherwise known as ISWAP. And what I've argued for the past several years is that the insurgency is in a stalemate. Essentially, it has been mostly confined to northeastern Nigeria, Borno, Yobe, and Adamawa. If you could envision it transferred to the United States, it would be as if the entire insurgency was just in New England and the rest of the country was largely unaffected directly by the conflict. Just as in Nigeria, it's all occurring in the Northeast, at least for the past several years. And the main dynamic of the insurgency, as is typical of many insurgencies around the world now and historically, is that the military of Nigeria has been effective at controlling major population centers in northeastern Nigeria, namely the local government area administrative centers and the capital of Borno, Maiduguri. ISWAP, which is the largest faction affiliated to Islamic State, has attempted to take over these administrative centers, but in general, the military is able to repel them through what is called the super camp strategy, where the military has erected pretty strong fortresses around these population centers. But ISWAP has largely moved with ease in the countryside in rural northeastern Nigeria, and specifically Borno State. And the stalemate has just been that ISWAP has not succeeded at taking the major town centers, but the military has also been ineffective at expelling ISWAP from the rural parts of the northeastern Nigeria that it controls. And for the past few years, it's just been this dynamic. And the military at times would go into the rural areas and get ambushed. And I think they've actually decreased their attempts to really rid ISWAP of its presence in the rural areas. And ISWAP has actually decreasingly tried to take over the major town centers in the Northeast. I still think that this is generally negative for the Nigerian military, because the fact that ISWAP has so much control in the Northeast, in the rural areas, allows it to recruit, give birth to new soldiers who are probably going to become 10 and 12, 15 and become fighters soon. And we constantly see youths in combat videos and training videos now. And so that's been the dynamic. Now, what's been changing in literally the past few weeks is that ISWAP, for the very first time since ISWAP's formation in 2015, as a new iteration of the insurgency that we call Boko Haram since 2009, is that in the past few weeks, it has been claiming attacks verifiably in other parts of Nigeria, like Taraba State, Kogi State, which is south of the capital Abuja, in the center of the country. Taraba is also in the center of the country. And in general, it made a claim in central Nigeria without specifying the state. So for the first time, ISWAP is taking the insurgency out from northeastern Nigeria, where it's controlling rural areas, to more asymmetric attacks in the center of Nigeria. And the question is, what's causing this strategic shift, and what are the implications? Well, first, I would point out that in 2012, and to a certain extent in 2013, and a little bit even into 2014 and 15, attacks in the center of Nigeria around the capital Abuja were fairly common. And those were also asymmetric attacks, like suicide car bombings targeting churches or bars and the like. And that was done by Boko Haram. Of course, ISWAP hadn't pledged allegiance to ISIS yet, so it hadn't formed. And those attacks in central Nigeria in 2012 had a very big psychological effect on Nigeria, as terrorism was intended to do. It's intended to affect the victim's psychology, because it made Nigerians feel that anywhere is unsafe if the insurgents could carry out attacks in Kaduna and Jos and anywhere. And so we see this reviving again through ISWAP's claims of attacking bars in Taraba and other public places in Kogi. And I think that really has the potential to make the insurgency like a double-edged sword. At the one time, you're fighting ISWAP with its territorial control in the Northeast, and at the same time, you will increasingly have to be worried about ISWAP carrying out asymmetric attacks in public areas in the center of the country, which means that once again, like 10 years ago, people in Nigeria will get the feeling that anywhere is not safe, and this isn't something that the military is confined to the Northeast. Some broader context of this ISWAP expansion is also relevant to note. For several years now, anybody who has been following Boko Haram has been known that bandits have been increasing their activities in the northeast of Nigeria. And these include kidnappings, mass kidnappings, in fact, and other forms of extortions and raids on farmers, herders, and the like. But the Boko Haram faction, led by the ruthless Abu Bakr Shekau, who was killed in a raid by ISWAP a year ago, that faction had been attempting to move to the northwest for about 2 or 3 years. At the same time, you have the Al-Qaeda faction called Ansaru, which has also based itself in the northwest for several years and has tried to win over bandits to its cause, which is the Al-Qaeda cause, because it's a small Al-Qaeda affiliate. And they've been trying to convert bandits from being pure criminals to sort of being ideologues, although they still might engage in criminality. And so you've been seeing these attempts to mix with the bandits in the northwest. ISWAP, which is the largest faction in the northeast, is now obviously moving towards the northwest as well and embedding there. And so what we're seeing is an increased, you could say, entrenchment of the jihadist factions who originated in the northeast, now in the center of Nigeria and the northwest. So it doesn't mean that all the bandit groups have been co-opted into being jihadists, but the concerns that analysts had about jihadists mixing with bandits appears to be taking another step higher because of these verifiable ISWAP claims in central Nigeria. I also think what might be motivating the ISWAP push out of the Northeast is that it's trying to demonstrate its capabilities to ISIS center. Despite ISIS center's struggle in Syria and Iraq now, they're not nearly as strong as they used to be. ISWAP is 100% loyal to ISIS. There's no signs of any type of questioning of that loyalty. So by carrying out attacks in the past month outside of northeastern Nigeria, it's able to show ISIS that it's able to do some spectacular attacks. And these attacks were claimed under revenge for the Two Sheikhs campaign of ISIS, which is where the provinces of ISIS around the world were asked to carry out increased attacks in honor of the two caliphs of ISIS that have been killed in the past several years in US raids. So they might be trying to impress ISIS. And I also think after several years of stalemate in the Northeast, ISWAP might be trying to change up the dynamics and force the military to expend resources now, watching the center of Nigeria instead of only the Northeast. You might also consider competition. ISWAP is major rivals with the Boko Haram faction, formerly led by Abu Bakr Shekau, the ruthless leader who they killed last year. Shekau's faction persists, mostly in Lake Chad now, around the lake in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, that type of area. But they still have some, at least they had some loyalists in the Northwest. So ISWAP has actually been recruiting defectors from the Shekau faction, now that he's dead, into ISWAP ranks in the Northeast. And so they might be attempting to take some other Shekau loyalists from center or Northwest Nigeria. So at one time, they're sort of meeting their competitor by operating outside of northeastern Nigeria. On the other side, they're also bringing in former Shekau loyalists now that he's deceased. And ISWAP is also enemies with Ansaru, the small Al-Qaeda faction, because of their different loyalties. And so they need to move to the Northwest, or at least to the center, to sort of compete with Ansaru's presence there. Ansaru itself has been trying to elevate its presence in the Northwest by carrying out attacks that it has claimed in Kaduna in the Northwest in recent weeks, as well as by upgrading its media to be part of Al-Qaeda's official global media system. For several years, Ansaru had been basically doing its own media. Now its media is controlled by Al-Qaeda's global Islamic media front. And the last point I make about the shift to the center in the Northwest is that even during these past few years, when ISWAP has been almost exclusively fighting in the Northeast and specifically Borno State, ISWAP still has had logistics networks in Northwest Nigeria, where it's carrying out attacks now, or that general region. Because, for example, sometimes the group needs computers. So they'll obviously need to have people go to the main city centers and get computers, or they've gotten drones, or all other types of supplies. So it's been well known by at least analysts who I have spoken to in Nigeria, that ISWAP has people all over the country to help raise finances and whatnot. So it's not too hard for ISWAP to simply activate those logistics/sleeper cells elsewhere in the country to launch several attacks. So in sum, that's what I really wanted to highlight. I also would put it in context of my latest article, which Adam had kindly mentioned, which is called Boko Haram's Beginnings. And it was about a Guantánamo document that no one had written on, despite that it was leaked more than 10 years ago. And it showed that Al-Qaeda had a presence in Nigeria earlier than people had expected, well before 9/11, where it tried to recruit small cells. Today, it's obvious that ISWAP is loyal to ISIS. And I think this just shows that on one side, there's a lot of domestic aspects of this group. It's really focused on fighting Nigeria at the end of the day. But at the same time, since the very beginning of this group, there's been loyalties to outside groups like Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, depending on the faction. And so to understand the movement today, you really need to look at the domestic dynamics and the international dynamics to understand a trend like what we're seeing with ISWAP. The key domestic dynamic, for example, might be the rise in banditry in the Northwest and attempts by ISWAP and the other jihadi factions to link up with those bandits. And the key international aspect would be ISIS's attempt to elevate its presence globally, and ISWAP being its most important province because it's the strongest one, needs to carry out attacks to further the ISIS brand. And carrying out attacks outside of northeastern Nigeria also helps ISIS. So we have these dual dynamics that you can use to understand ISWAP's trajectory. And I think at that, I'll leave off my initial presentation, but I'll be more than glad to expound upon this through the Q&A.
Thank you, Jacob, very much. That was very useful, and I hope the participants enjoyed that as well. Just to remind everybody, please, your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Next time we'll try and have a map up. I think it would help if we had a map so that, when we're talking about places which are maybe not household names. One of the questions I had for you, Jacob, is we struggle in our project with, the role and the evolution of the Fulanis and now the Zamfara militants. And I'm just wondering if you could perhaps expound a little bit on the interrelationships between what you, I think, call bandits and Boko Haram and any kind of other terrorist groups.
Yeah, I think this is an important area for terminological development. So we often refer to these militants in the Northwest as bandits, but it's really unclear what actually do we mean by bandits, because when we think of bandits in the United States, I tend to think of like the Wild West and stealing things off of trains and whatnot. But the bandits in the Northwest have become northwest of Nigeria have become so well armed and so organized and so sophisticated with leadership that, they're more like cartels, if you would. They're a professional, very well armed, militant organizations focused on basically getting money through illegal means. But you also can't deny that they have some types of grievances based on their feeling that the government is not resourcing their areas in the Northwest well enough. So they feel that it's justified to do extortion of, say, government officials or bank employees or whatnot. And so that has, and then you have to also look at factors like weapons trafficking throughout the borders of the Sahel and, herders moving across borders to understand those regional and domestic dynamics. But because they're so well armed, they've become, a useful target for the jihadists. But the thing is, their ideologies are different. The jihadi ideology is quite different from the bandits ones, who, in a sense, are not necessarily even devout or explicitly devout. That's why it's actually been several years that we've been witnessing the attempts by the jihadists to integrate with these bandit groups or criminal cartels. And it clearly has not been smooth. But I think as we see this occur for the past 5 years and into the next 5 years, it's going to be more time for the jihadists and the bandits to work out their alliances and their agreements and see what works with them. And in some cases, it's important to know the jihadists are killing the bandits, for example, if they don't ally with them. So we have sort of a not smooth transition and attempt to integrate with each other. But I think over time, the necessary alliances that the jihadists want and the bandits want will occur. The jihadists want to expand their influence, and the bandits could use the weapons, the training, perhaps the financing from the jihadists.
Excellent. Here's a related question. Vincent Fouché, thank you for the great presentation. 2 questions. I wonder what you make of James Barnett's argument that the encounter between jihadi and bandits is actually not that easy. We have seen Ansaru promoting itself heavily as an anti-bandit movement, putting out pics of bandits they had killed. So perhaps, in fact, they are closer to Hausa urban communities than with Fulani bandits. And the second part of this is it's remarkable that ISWAP is not attacking in the Northwest, where indeed it has logistics network, but in Taraba, Koji, and Bauchi. What do you make of that?
Yeah, these are for those who follow Boko Haram closely, these are the very pressing questions, which are really hard to answer. I think James Barnett's argument that basically the jihadists are not necessarily integrating with the bandits, but actually fighting them is worthy of consideration. I think part of the reason why they might be fighting the bandits is one, to win local support, because the bandits harass communities. And so by fighting the bandits, they can win that support. But I also think Ansaru's attempt to integrate with the bandits may have failed, and therefore Ansaru is fighting them, because the bandits maybe didn't follow Ansaru's ideological convictions. At the same time, I don't think we can say that they're all against each other, because Abu Bakr Shekau, when he was alive, of course, had communications with the bandit group that kidnapped hundreds of students in the town of Kankara in Katsina State. So that was evidence of them trying to link up and help each other. That's why, for lack of better terminology, I said a not smooth integration effort. And maybe, as it will turn out, the jihadists and the bandits are not that compatible, and the jihadists will end up simply fighting against them and trying to take over their territories. But I have a feeling in some cases it will work, in some cases it won't. And it also really related to that question, it's notable that Ansaru was initially largely using Fulani narratives, and but still appealing to Hausas, because its language used was Hausa in videos. And so yeah, it's possible that Ansaru has appealed to like an urban intellectual elite, which is typical of original Al-Qaeda followers, actually, and that might put it at odds with, say, rural bandits. As for ISWAP carrying out these attacks in Kogi and Taraba, I also think it's interesting, and it might be, if I had to speculate, the fact that ISWAP was not able to succeed in getting into northwestern Nigeria, where Ansaru and perhaps Shekau has better routes. So it had to find states that those two other rival factions are not operating in, and that gave the opportunity for Taraba and Kogi. But it's notable that Kogi used to be an Ansaru hotbed, and so it's interesting that it's now an ISWAP one, or potentially ISWAP one.
Another question in the chat. Just to remind everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Here's a question. What do you make of ISWAP's recent use of suicide vehicle-borne IEDs recently in the Northeast, specifically Borno, where there has been quite an increase in the past months? Is this a sign of strength, or more a sign that the group is struggling under military pressure and resorting to these techniques?
I think both are possible. It is true the military has been uncovering a lot of ISWAP hideouts and former Shekau faction hideouts. I don't think the fighting is that intense, though, because ISWAP or the former Shekau members just leave their hideouts as part of a guerrilla strategy. But I would be tempted to look at this data, if it's correct, I haven't followed that trend, as part of a general shift in ISWAP tactics, which involves it shifting out of the Northeast and perhaps utilizing suicide car bombs. It has been utilizing suicide car bombs for several years, so its ability to create those suicide car bombs is probably getting more sophisticated, and that might also explain why we're seeing it more and more.
Okay, we've got another question here. Please, folks, questions in the Q&A function. Got lots of time, so Chuck, I'm sure you must have a question if you're listening in. Next question is, thank you for sharing these insights. Following up on the local versus global dynamics, are there indications that ISIS Central wants ISWAP to operate beyond Nigeria and internationalize the group's sphere of influence?
I don't see any evidence that ISIS is encouraging ISWAP to carry out attacks internationally, such as in Europe or the United States. And there's no signs from ISWAP rhetoric at this point that it seeks to attack externally, nor have there really been any clear signs that ISWAP has deployed members to Europe or the United States to plot attacks. So for now, I would say no. The only recent report of relevance on that note is that there were some ISWAP funders arrested in the United Arab Emirates, but details are a little bit murky about that. But that was mostly financing rather than, say, carrying out attacks. So for now, I wouldn't look at ISWAP as in terms of external operations, except for outside of northeastern Nigeria into other parts of Nigeria, and both ISWAP and the former Shekau faction around Lake Chad in Niger, Chad, and Cameroon.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Dr. Cengiz. What are the similarities and differences between Boko Haram and ISWAP in terms of ideology, tactics, and targets? Which one would be more threatening for the Western world in the near future?
The ideologies are really quite different. To make it very simple, Shekau believed anyone who did not fight with Shekau was not a Muslim and therefore was able to be killed or enslaved, especially if they were a Christian woman. ISWAP is not to say it's not ruthless, but it has generally stated that ordinary Muslims who are not opposing them can still be considered Muslims and should not be killed. Which one's more threatening? I've considered this actually a major dilemma from the Nigerian perspective. Shekau's ideology is certainly more ruthless, and those of his followers, because he's now dead. And that makes it worse for civilians and more dangerous for civilians, but it's also way beyond the pale of mainstream Islamic ideology, even more than that of ISWAP. So I think ISWAP has more potential because of its relative moderation compared to Shekau to attract alienated Muslims or other Muslims that for whatever reason might be interested in the group. So in general, I would say ISWAP is more of a concern in that ideology, simply because it's not as extreme as Shekau's, notwithstanding that it is still extreme.
Okay, folks, we still have time for questions. So if you'd like to enter them into the Q&A function, we will ask them of our guest. I have one for you, Jacob. One of the things that, you know, there's an election coming up in Nigeria. We've seen that obviously all of the candidates are, you know, tough on terror, tough on crime, tough on violence. So the military have stepped up their activities. Where do you think this may bleed? Which other countries and areas do you think this may get pushed to? We've seen recently incidents in Benin and other countries on the border of Nigeria. I'm just wondering if you've got any insights.
And that's why I think it's important to observe trends when they're just beginning and embryonic. And a good example of that is this issue of the bandits and the jihadis in Nigeria fighting each other. We observed the very beginning of those trends several years ago when they were very small and perhaps nothing would manifest. But now after 5 years, we see there's definitely some dynamic between the bandits and jihadis. And so when you mention places like Benin or Togo, right now we see very small scale evidence of jihadi interest there. And I think it's worth paying attention to because 5 years from now, it might become somewhat of a flashpoint. But the thing about Benin is that we see that coming from the Sahel side, you know, the Burkina Faso-based groups, you know, gradually moving towards Benin, same with the Mali-based groups, particularly the Al-Qaeda ones, but also the Islamic State in Greater Sahara. But then you've also seen the jihadis move closer to the Beninese border coming from Nigeria. And this points to this interesting and potentially scary issue of eventually it's possible that the Boko Haram factions, including ISWAP, will end up moving towards Niamey, towards Benin, towards Togo, and the jihadis from the Sahel will. And this will create some new type of dynamic that we really haven't seen yet. And so for that, I think it's just worth scenario planning for. You know, what could that look like? Personally, I think it could look like is the Ansuru faction, which is in northwestern Nigeria and is loyal to Al-Qaeda, is perhaps best capable of sort of integrating with the Sahel groups because it is an Al-Qaeda faction and the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Mali is strongest there. And in 2012 and 2011, Ansuru had very close ties with the Mali-based Al-Qaeda members. And because Ansuru is closely tied with or rivaling bandits, it probably has the local connections to sort of immerse there. So I think that's like an embryonic phase now, but it definitely has the potential to become a flashpoint, especially if it is overlooked. When you look at these countries like Benin, Togo, even the borders of Ghana, and even Ivory Coast.
Okay, we have another one here, which is looking at a little more detail on the targeting. So ISWAP tends to discriminate in its targets, mostly state institutions and the military, whereas Boko Haram is mostly civilians. I think you already mentioned this. How is it impacting the support of the locals for these two groups? So if, for example, if Boko Haram is attacking civilians, why would they get any support from the locals?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that's why I don't think that the Shekau faction, which we call Boko Haram, has much civilian support. But they can compel support because you can't defy them. Two, they have tons of children that have been born in their ranks in the past 15 years. And now you have children who are 15 years old fighting with Boko Haram. So they can almost produce their own fighters to stay active, especially because they control areas of the countryside. And that will only increase over time. I can't emphasize enough the importance of hundreds of children being born in the group, growing up as fighters. So that's how Shekau's faction is able to sustain itself. But also, just as in the Northwest, there are bandits, there are also other types of criminal groups around Lake Chad that Shekau's faction can ally with because they have similar goals in some ways. But that also presents an opportunity for ISWAP, because ISWAP, as the more moderate faction compared to Shekau's faction, can say, look, we're going to fight Shekau and take his loyalists out, and now we're going to control here, and we're not going to kill you if you're just an ordinary Muslim and you don't oppose us. So for a civilian, they might say, thank you, ISWAP, please come in here, get rid of Shekau, and we're not going to oppose you. And the other thing about ISWAP is if the military, if they cooperate with the military, then ISWAP will kill the civilians. So some civilians might be in a pickle where they say, we're going to allow ISWAP in to get rid of Shekau, but we're not going to cooperate with the military to get ISWAP out because we don't want ISWAP to ransack us. And ISWAP has massacred civilians in the past. So that's part of the local recruitment dynamics when it comes to the Northeast.
Here's another good question. What is your view on the purported Ansaru Boko Haram involvement in the Abuja Kaduna train attack? And do you believe other bandit groups will copy the use of IEDs in complex attacks in the same way they have copied the tactics of the Kankara school kidnap in other states over 2021?
Yeah, I think this train attack in Kaduna, where more than 100 people were abducted, is notable because I think, as you have seen in the past few years, and as you have seen in this train attack, and as you will see in the future, there's going to be these types of attacks in the Northwest that are somewhat atypical compared to previous tactics and tend to have some type of influence beyond just banditry that has been known in Northwestern Nigeria. And it involves the influence of either Ansaru or Boko Haram or jihadists of a faction that maybe left the faction and are now operating independently. So I would look at the Kankara kidnapping of hundreds of schoolboys in the Northwest as a similar typology to the train attack, a completely new tactic, likely influenced by jihadists who have not a really clear organizational affiliation and who carry out a very brazen and new attack. In Kankara, it became clear that Boko Haram was involved because Shekau issued a video to claim it, even though he wasn't directly involved. And the train attack seems to be similar, and we'll see, who emerges as responsible in the future. But I wouldn't be surprised to see these other types of landmark attacks in the Northwest that involve the jihadis. But one thing the jihadis are missing when you look at terrorism studies is a strong leadership in the Northwest. Shekau, as ruthless as he was a unifying leader that everyone knew who he was, everyone knew his beliefs, and he was sort of a dictator. I think part of the reason why the Northwest situation is so scattered is there's not anyone to really unite the jihadis now. Even ISWAP doesn't have a clear leader. And so until someone really emerges to unite the jihadis in the Northwest, I would expect to see continued brazen but scattered attacks where the claiming is not that organized, especially because there's no real media wing for these jihadis in the Northwest.
Okay, we have two more questions for you. do you know how the integration of Boko Haram fighters into ISWAP is going in terms of the internal cohesion transition?
I think initially it was going well for ISWAP insofar as the Boko Haram fighters in Sambisa Borno, which was Shekau's base, were joining ISWAP, and I think that has happened. And that was a success for ISWAP. Other Boko Haram members after Shekau's death retired and either didn't fight or surrendered to the military, which was good for the military. But I think it's clear that there are some Shekau faction holdouts, especially around Lake Chad, that are very determined to resist ISWAP and continue their presence and continue the Boko Haram legacy after Shekau. And so I would expect continued friction and fighting between ISWAP and the former Shekau loyalists or the former Shekau faction members in particularly the Lake Chad area. And I don't think the integration is going well for ISWAP around Lake Chad. And I think also one of the reasons for the rise of jihadist activity in the Northwest is also because of Shekau's death and fighters sort of not knowing where to go and perhaps feeling that ISWAP will do retribution on them. So they're moving to the Northwest and trying to form their own startup jihadi outfits.
Here's another, you mentioned ISWAP and Ansaru making attempts to settle down in the Northwest. As the Nigerian government of people have experienced the horrific consequences of terrorism in the Northeast. What should the government, Western world do to prevent the expansion of these two groups in the Northwest region?
Well, that's a really key question that probably a lot of minds need to come together to answer. But one would be looking at the grievances of people in the Northwest about lack of government attention, about corruption, and not protecting farmland, and not helping those communities, because that can lead to some people joining bandit groups and eventually jihadi groups. I think it would be important to develop relationships with local communities. I think the factions, when they come into local communities, they will often preach their Islamic teachings. And if the government doesn't have any connections to those communities, there won't be anyone to work with the government to prevent the jihadists from infiltrating those communities. And then I would answer those two things, but there's obviously a lot more that needs to be done.
Okay, the last question. ISWAP was able to locate and kill Shekau last year, despite the fact that the Nigerian military had been after him for years. How do you see the capacity of the Nigerian military and law enforcement in its fight against jihadi groups in the country?
I think the capacity of the Nigerian military has really proven to be best at essentially conventional warfare, but they're not fighting a conventional war. And so what they've proven to be best at is establishing fortress around towns and cities and protecting them. But when it comes to the types of things you need to do to win a guerrilla war in the countryside, like acquiring intelligence on the movements of the jihadis in the rural areas, or winning over the support of the civilians in the local areas, that's been lacking somewhat. And it's not easy. And I would just say it hasn't been particularly effective, the counterinsurgency in the rural areas, for whatever reasons, and we could discuss at a different time. But one of the examples of this is the fact that, Shekau eluded capture for basically almost 15 years from the military. They couldn't get him. And then it turned out that a rival faction got him. So at the end of the day, the jihadi factions know more about each other than the military probably knows about them. At the same time, that does lead to some possibilities, as when there are rivalries and defections and conflict between the jihadis, the military, if it is clever and able, it can acquire intelligence on rival factions from the other rivals and perhaps eliminate the leaders of those groups or find out where their hideouts are. There might be some opportunity there.
Excellent. Well, we've come to the end of our questions and the end of the presentation. Jacob, I'd like to thank you once again for your very able talk and taking the time to answer all of the questions in some detail. We'll hope to have you back when you publish your next book.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everybody all of the participants, everybody who was listening in and posing those questions. Our next speaker series will be on May the 23rd. You'll be receiving the usual communication from us, but please mark your calendars. Have a good day, everybody, and see you soon. Thank you again, Jacob. Bye-bye.